Elena Marchetti's scream tore through the hospital hallway before the nurse even finished her sentence. One bassinet was empty. The tag on it still read, "Baby Girl Marchetti, Twin B," but the small bundle that should have been wrapped inside was gone. Elena's hands shook as she gripped the metal rail of her hospital bed, trying to stand even though her legs could barely hold her weight after the delivery. A nurse rushed to stop her, pressing gentle but firm hands against her shoulders, telling her to please stay calm, please stay in bed, but Elena was not listening. Her whole body was listening for something else, a cry, a breath, anything that would tell her baby Sophia was still somewhere close, still safe, still hers. Only hours earlier, Elena had been the happiest woman in the world. She had given birth to twin girls, Isabella and Sophia, two tiny lives that had once shared the same heartbeat inside her. The delivery had gone well. The doctor said both girls were healthy, both breathing on their own, both perfect. Dante Marchetti, her husband, had held both daughters at once, one in each arm, and for a moment, his usually guarded face had softened into something Elena had never seen before. He looked, for the first time in years, like an ordinary man holding his ordinary joy. Elena had memorized that image, thinking she would carry it with her forever. Now, less than 6 hours later, that image felt like it belonged to a different life. The head nurse, a woman named Carol Whitfield, arrived at the room with 2 hospital security officers trailing behind her. Her face was pale, her voice unsteady, as she tried to explain that the overnight nursery log showed the baby had been checked at 11:15, sleeping soundly, and that the next check at midnight had found the bassinet already empty. No alarms had gone off. No cameras in that section of the hallway had captured a clear image, because, as it turned out, one of the 2 hallway cameras had mysteriously stopped recording sometime around 11 that same night. Elena did not care about cameras or logs or explanations. She wanted her daughter back in her arms, and every second that passed without that happening felt like a knife twisting slowly into her chest. She looked at Dante, waiting for him to do something, to say something, to use whatever power a man like him held to fix what should never have been broken in the first place. But Dante was standing very still near the window, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only he could see. He was not panicking. He was not asking questions the way a frightened father should. He was thinking, calculating, already 3 steps ahead, in a way that frightened Elena almost as much as the empty bassinet did. "Dante," she said, her voice cracking. "Where is she? Where is our daughter?" He turned to her then, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face. Guilt maybe, or fear, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the calm, controlled mask he wore whenever the world around him grew dangerous. "I will find her," he said quietly. "I promise you, Elena, I will find her." It was not the answer she needed. She needed him to be as broken as she was. She needed him to fall apart beside her, so she would not feel so alone in her terror. Instead, he reached for his phone, stepped into the hallway, and made a call in a low voice she could not fully hear, though she caught fragments. Words like "handle it," and "quietly," and "not the police." That last phrase struck her like a slap. Not the police. Her daughter was missing, and her husband's first instinct was to keep the authorities out of it. Elena had known, of course, what kind of man she married. Dante Marchetti was not a businessman in the way he liked to introduce himself at charity dinners and community events. Beneath the tailored suits and the generous donations to local schools, he ran an organization that controlled large parts of the city's shipping routes, its private lending, and quietly, its silence. People who crossed the Marchetti family did not always get a second chance to apologize. Elena had accepted this reality years ago, telling herself that whatever happened in Dante's world stayed in that world, far from the walls of their home, far from their children. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that their family was untouchable, protected precisely because of who Dante was. Now she understood how wrong she had been. Their family had not been protected by Dante's power. It had been made a target because of it. The hospital administrator arrived soon after, a nervous man named Gerald Whitmore, sweating through his collar as he explained that the police had been notified, that an Amber Alert would go out within the hour, that every exit in the building was being reviewed on camera footage from the previous night. Elena listened to all of it, with a strange, hollow numbness settling over her, as if she were watching someone else's nightmare unfold on a television screen. This could not be happening to her. Not after 9 months of waiting, of dreaming, of choosing names and painting a nursery in soft yellow because they had wanted to be surprised by the baby's genders, until the very end. Isabella, the surviving twin, was brought to her only minutes later, and Elena held her tightly against her chest, feeling the baby's small heartbeat flutter beneath her palm. She should have felt relief holding one healthy daughter safe in her arms. Instead, all she felt was the aching absence of the other, a phantom weight that seemed to press down on her chest, even though nothing was there. Isabella began to cry, a thin, restless wail that did not stop, no matter how Elena rocked her, no matter how softly she sang. It was as though the baby, too small to understand words or explanations, somehow knew that half of herself was missing. By morning, Elena's body had begun doing something strange, something the doctors could not fully explain, though they tried their best to reassure her it was simply the natural result of carrying twins. Her milk had come in fully, enough to feed 2 babies, and her body, unaware of the horror that had unfolded during the night, continued preparing itself, as though Sophia would be brought back to nurse any moment. Elena would sit in the hospital room, Isabella asleep in her arms, and feel her body ache with the readiness to feed a second child who was not there. It was a cruel kind of biology, one that refused to accept what her mind already knew. Her body still believed Sophia was alive, still believed she would be handed back any second, still believed in a reunion that had not yet, and might never, come. Detective Renata Alvarez was assigned to the case by mid-morning, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who had built a reputation for solving cases other detectives had given up on. She arrived at the hospital with a calm, steady presence that Elena found herself grateful for, even in the middle of her panic. Detective Alvarez asked careful, methodical questions. Who had visited the hospital the night before? Who had access to the maternity ward? Whether anyone, staff or family, had behaved unusually in the hours before Sophia disappeared. Elena answered as best she could, though her mind kept drifting back to Dante's phone call in the hallway. Not the police. She thought about mentioning it to the detective, but something held her back, some instinct telling her that revealing too much too soon might make things worse, might push Dante's world of secrets even further into shadow. Dante, for his part, cooperated with the detective in a way that seemed almost too smooth, too rehearsed, giving short, careful answers that revealed nothing beyond the bare facts. He gave no names of enemies, no mention of business disputes, nothing that might explain why someone would target his family in such a personal, devastating way. Elena watched him during the questioning, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. He was hiding something. She was certain of it now, as certain as she had ever been of anything. That evening, after Detective Alvarez left with a promise to return the next day, Dante's closest associate arrived at the hospital. His name was Salvatore Greco, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and eyes that never seemed to fully meet anyone's gaze. Salvatore had been with Dante since before Elena had even entered his life, a loyal soldier who handled the parts of the business Dante preferred to keep separate from polite conversation. Salvatore greeted Elena with practiced sympathy, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed rather than sincere, before pulling Dante aside for a private conversation near the far end of the hallway. Elena could not hear their words, but she could see their body language, the way Salvatore's shoulders tensed, the way Dante's hand curled into a fist at his side before he forced it open again. Whatever they discussed, it was not comforting news. When Dante returned to the room, his face had gone pale beneath his olive skin, and though he tried to reassure Elena that everything was being handled, his voice lacked its usual confidence. "What did he say to you?" Elena asked, her voice sharp with exhaustion and fear. "Nothing important," Dante replied, avoiding her eyes. "Just business matters, nothing that concerns Sophia." Elena did not believe him, not for a single second, but she was too tired, too raw with grief, to push further that night. She held Isabella close instead, watching her daughter's small chest rise and fall with each breath, memorizing every detail of her tiny face, as though committing it to memory, might somehow protect her from disappearing too. The night stretched on endlessly. Nurses came and went, checking Elena's vitals, checking Isabella's temperature, offering quiet words of comfort that did little to ease the storm raging inside her. Around 2 in the morning, Elena woke from a shallow, restless sleep, certain she had heard crying down the hallway. A thin, familiar wail that sounded exactly like Sophia's first cries in the delivery room hours earlier. She sat up so quickly her stitches pulled painfully, and she called out for a nurse, insisting someone check the hallway, check the nursery, check anywhere a baby's cry might be coming from. The nurse who came to check found nothing. No baby, no cry, only the quiet hum of hospital machines and the distant murmur of the night shift at their station. Elena apologized, embarrassed, blaming exhaustion and grief for playing tricks on her mind. But long after the nurse left, she lay awake, certain that what she had heard had been real, certain that somewhere in this building, or somewhere far beyond it, her daughter was crying for her, and she was powerless to answer. By dawn, exhaustion finally pulled Elena into a deeper sleep, though it did not last long. She woke to the sound of her own name being called softly, and opened her eyes to find Dante sitting beside her bed, his face haggard, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he had not slept at all. For a moment, hope flared in her chest, thinking perhaps he had news, perhaps Sophia had been found, but his expression told a different story. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure it was closed. "About last night. About why I said not to call the police so quickly." Elena's heart pounded. This was it, she realized. Whatever truth he had been hiding, whatever darkness lived at the edges of his world, it was about to spill into the light, whether either of them was ready for it or not. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me everything, Dante. I need to know what happened to our daughter." He opened his mouth to speak, but before the words could come, a soft knock interrupted them, and a nurse entered carrying a folder of discharge paperwork, informing them gently that Isabella was healthy enough to go home whenever they were ready. Though, of course, they were welcome to stay longer given the circumstances. The moment shattered. Dante closed his mouth, straightened his posture, and told Elena they would talk later, in private, away from hospital walls and hospital ears. Elena wanted to scream, wanted to demand he finish what he started, but the nurse's presence made that impossible. She nodded instead, swallowing her frustration, promising herself that the moment they were alone again, she would not let him avoid the truth any longer. Whatever secret Dante Marchetti was carrying, whatever role his world of shadows and silence had played in Sophia's disappearance, Elena intended to drag it into the open, no matter what it cost either of them. As the nurse helped her prepare Isabella for discharge, Elena caught her own reflection in the room's small mirror. She looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, aged years in the span of a single night. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something else was beginning to stir, something that felt almost like fire. Grief had brought her to her knees, but it would not keep her there. She would find her daughter, with or without her husband's help, with or without the protection of his dangerous world. She held Isabella a little tighter and whispered a promise into the soft curve of her daughter's ear. A promise meant just as much for the daughter who was missing as the one safely in her arms. "I will bring your sister home," she said, "no matter what it takes." Outside the hospital window, the morning sun climbed slowly over the city skyline, indifferent to the storm gathering beneath it. Somewhere out there, in a world Elena was only beginning to understand, her daughter was waiting to be found. And somewhere close by, someone who knew exactly what had happened was still keeping silent, waiting to see how much Elena Marchetti was willing to risk to learn the truth. Elena did not remember the drive home from the hospital. One moment she was signing discharge papers with hands that would not stop trembling, and the next she was standing in the doorway of the nursery she and Dante had painted together, staring at 2 matching cribs, one of which would remain empty. Isabella slept in her arms, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, unaware of the hole that had opened in their family before she was even a full day old. Elena walked to the empty crib and rested her hand against the cool wooden rail, half expecting, half hoping, that if she waited long enough, Sophia would simply appear there, safe and whole, and this entire nightmare would reveal itself as nothing more than a terrible dream. Dante did not follow her into the nursery. She heard him instead in his study downstairs, his voice low and urgent as he spoke with someone on the phone. The study door closed, but not quite enough to block out the tension in his tone. Elena stood at the top of the stairs and listened, catching only pieces of the conversation. He mentioned a name she did not recognize, someone called Marco, and used a phrase that chilled her more than anything else she had heard since Sophia vanished. He said, "If they wanted to send a message, they succeeded. Now I need to know who delivered it." A message. Someone had taken her daughter to send Dante a message. Elena's knees nearly buckled beneath her, and she gripped the stair railing to steady herself, careful not to wake Isabella in her arms. This was not a random act. This was not some stranger who wandered into a hospital nursery on impulse. Someone had planned this, had chosen Sophia specifically, had used an innocent newborn as a weapon against her husband's world of power and fear. She wanted to march down the stairs and demand answers immediately, but exhaustion and the fragile weight of her sleeping daughter held her back. Instead, she carried Isabella to the nursery, laid her gently in the one crib that was not empty, and sat in the rocking chair beside it, watching her daughter breathe, counting each rise and fall of her tiny chest, as though counting might somehow keep her safe. Sleep did not come easily that first night home. Every small sound in the house, every creak of the old wooden floors, every whisper of wind against the windows, sent Elena's heart racing, convinced for one terrifying second that it might be Sophia crying somewhere just out of reach. Her body continued its strange, cruel ritual, aching with the readiness to nurse a child who was not there, waking her at regular intervals with a physical need her mind could not reconcile with reality. She would sit in the darkness of the nursery, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, her arms curled as though cradling an invisible weight, and wonder if this ache would ever fade, or if her body, like her heart, had simply refused to accept the truth. The following morning, Detective Alvarez returned as promised, this time accompanied by a colleague, a younger officer named Patrick Doyle, who carried a laptop bag and a folder thick with printed photographs. They sat with Elena and Dante in the living room, Isabella sleeping peacefully in a bassinet nearby, while the detectives laid out what little evidence they had gathered so far. The hospital's security footage had confirmed that the hallway camera nearest the nursery had indeed stopped recording at 11:03 the previous night, and initial technical analysis suggested the malfunction had not been accidental. Someone with knowledge of the hospital's security system had disabled it deliberately, which meant this had not been the work of an opportunistic stranger, but someone with resources, planning, and inside knowledge. Detective Alvarez watched Dante's face carefully as she shared this detail, and Elena noticed the same careful, measured lack of surprise in her husband's expression that she had noticed the night before. "Mr. Marchetti," Detective Alvarez said, her tone polite but pointed, "is there anyone in your professional life who might want to hurt your family? Any disputes? Any threats? Anything at all that could explain why someone would target your daughter specifically?" Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I run a shipping and logistics company," he said smoothly. "Like any business, we occasionally have disagreements with competitors. Nothing that would explain something like this." Elena felt her stomach twist at the lie, so effortlessly delivered, so practiced in its delivery, that she almost believed it herself despite knowing better. Detective Alvarez did not look entirely convinced either, her eyes lingering on Dante a moment longer than necessary, before she moved on to her next question, though Elena suspected the detective was simply choosing not to press the issue yet, waiting instead to gather more evidence before confronting him directly. After the detectives left, Elena confronted Dante the moment the front door closed behind them. "I heard you on the phone last night," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "You said someone sent a message. What message, Dante? What have you not been telling me?" For a long moment, Dante said nothing, simply staring at the floor as though searching for the right words, or perhaps searching for the courage to say any words at all. Finally, he sank into the armchair near the fireplace, his usually composed posture crumbling into something smaller, wearier. "There are people," he said slowly, "who have wanted certain territories that belong to my family for a long time. There have been tensions, disagreements, negotiations that have not gone well recently. I did not think, I never imagined, that anyone would go this far to make a point. I thought we had time. I thought I could resolve things quietly before it came to this. Before what came to this? Elena demanded. Before someone stole our daughter from her hospital bed. Dante flinched at her words, guilt etched deeply into every line of his face. I don't know for certain who took her, he admitted. But I have suspicions, and I promise you, Elena, I am doing everything in my power to find out, and to bring her home. Everything in your power, Elena repeated bitterly. Is that why you told the detectives nothing useful? Is that why you're handling this quietly, instead of letting the police actually investigate properly? Because the police cannot move as quickly as I can, Dante said, his voice rising with frustration. Because whoever did this will disappear the moment they sense law enforcement closing in, and then we may never find her. I am not protecting myself, Elena. I am protecting our chance of getting Sophia back. Elena wanted to believe him, some desperate part of her, the part that still remembered the man who had held both their daughters with such tenderness in the delivery room, wanted nothing more than to trust that he was doing everything possible to bring Sophia home. But another part of her, colder and more clear-eyed, recognized that Dante's world of secrecy and power was precisely what had made their daughter a target in the first place. His silence had not protected their family, it had endangered it. Over the following days, Elena watched her husband transform into someone she barely recognized. He spent hours locked in his study, meeting with men she had never seen before, men who arrived in dark cars and left without ever making eye contact with her. Phone calls came at all hours, hushed conversations conducted in a mixture of English and Italian that Elena could only partially understand. Dante grew thinner, the shadows beneath his eyes deepening with each sleepless night, yet he offered Elena no real updates, no concrete progress, only vague reassurances that he was close to learning something important. Meanwhile, Isabella's behavior grew increasingly troubling. The infant, barely a week old, seemed unable to settle unless someone was constantly holding her, and even then, she would often startle awake from sleep, reaching her tiny arms outward as though searching for something, or someone, beside her. The pediatrician, a kind older woman named Dr. Louise Hartman, assured Elena that this behavior, while unusual, was not entirely unheard of among twins separated shortly after birth. Twins often developed a deep physical and emotional bond even in the womb, and some research suggested that separation, especially sudden and traumatic separation, could leave a lasting impact on the surviving twin. She may be sensing the absence in ways we don't fully understand, Dr. Hartman explained gently during one appointment, watching as Isabella cried inconsolably despite being warm, fed, and held. Some studies suggest twins can form attachments before birth that go beyond what we can measure or explain. It doesn't mean anything is wrong with her. It simply means her body and her instincts are telling her that something is missing. Elena found herself both comforted and devastated by this explanation. Comforted, because it validated the aching certainty she carried in her own body, the persistent belief that Sophia was still alive, still out there, still reachable if only someone looked hard enough. Devastated, because it meant her infant daughter was suffering too, carrying grief she could not yet understand or express in any way beyond restless cries and searching, empty arms. Determined to find answers Dante seemed unwilling or unable to provide, Elena began quietly gathering information of her own. She started small, reviewing old files Dante kept in a locked drawer of his study, files she had discovered the combination to years earlier, during a moment of idle curiosity she'd never acted upon until now. Most of the documents meant little to her, filled with shipping manifests and financial records she did not fully understand. But one folder caught her attention immediately. It contained correspondence between Dante and a man named Marco Belloni, the same name she had overheard during that first phone call the night Sophia disappeared. The letters, dated over the past several months, revealed an increasingly hostile dispute between Dante and Marco over control of a section of the city's waterfront, territory that had apparently belonged to Marco's family for decades before Dante's organization began encroaching on it. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Sophia's birth, contained a chilling warning, vague enough to avoid explicit threats, but unmistakable in its intent. Marco had written that Dante would soon learn what it felt like to lose something irreplaceable, just as Marco's own family had lost their territory, piece by piece over the years. Elena's hands shook as she read the words again and again, memorizing every detail. This was the connection Dante had been hiding, the enemy he refused to name to Detective Alvarez, the man whose grudge had likely cost them their daughter. She wanted to confront Dante immediately, but something held her back, some instinct warning her that revealing what she knew too soon might put her in danger as well, might make her a target the same way Sofia had become one. Instead, she began researching Marco Belloni quietly on her own, using the guest computer in Dante's study late at night while he slept, exhausted from his relentless search for answers. She learned that Marco ran a smaller but no less dangerous organization on the opposite side of the city, one that had been steadily losing ground to Dante's expanding influence over recent years. Public records showed a man who presented himself as a legitimate real estate investor, much the same way Dante presented himself as a shipping executive, though whispers online, buried deep in old forum posts and local news archives, hinted at a much darker reputation beneath the polished exterior. One evening, nearly a week after Sofia's disappearance, Elena discovered something that made her blood run cold. Buried within an old news article about a property dispute, she found a photograph of Marco Belloni standing beside several associates at a charity event. Standing just behind him, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a face Elena recognized instantly: Salvatore Greco, Dante's most trusted associate, the same man who had pulled Dante aside for a private conversation at the hospital the very night Sofia vanished. Elena stared at the photograph for a long time, her mind racing through the implications. Was Salvatore working with Marco? Had he betrayed Dante, feeding information to the rival family that allowed them to plan Sofia's disappearance with such precision? Or was there some other explanation, some innocent reason for the connection that she was too frightened and too desperate to see clearly? She knew she could not confront Salvatore directly, not without alerting him to what she had discovered, and certainly not without risking her own safety in the process. Instead, she decided to hire outside help, someone entirely separate from Dante's world, someone who could investigate quietly and report back to her alone. She remembered a name from years earlier, a private investigator named Frank Doland, who had once helped a friend locate a missing family member, discreet and thorough, unconnected to either Dante's organization or Marco's. Late that night, while Dante slept fitfully beside her, Elena slipped out of bed, retrieved her phone from the nightstand, and dialed the number she had found for Frank Dolan's office, leaving a quiet message requesting a meeting as soon as possible. She did not know yet what she would uncover, or how dangerous the truth might prove to be. But she knew, with a certainty that had settled deep into her bones since the moment Sofia vanished, that she could no longer wait quietly for others to bring her daughter home. If Dante would not tell her everything, and if the police could not move fast enough, then she would find the truth herself, no matter the cost. As she climbed back into bed, Isabella's soft, restless cries drifted through the baby monitor on the nightstand, a reminder of everything still broken, everything still missing. Elena closed her eyes and made herself a silent promise once again, the same promise she had whispered in the hospital just days before. She would find Sofia, she would bring her home, and she would discover exactly who among the people she trusted had played a role in tearing her family apart. Frank Dolan's office sat above a small bakery on a quiet street, tucked between a shoe repair shop and a dry cleaner, the kind of unremarkable location that made it easy to forget existed unless you were specifically looking for it. Elena arrived wearing a plain coat and sunglasses, her hair tucked beneath a scarf, taking every precaution she could think of to avoid being recognized or followed. She had told Dante she was visiting her sister for the afternoon, a lie that tasted bitter on her tongue, but felt necessary given everything she now suspected about the people surrounding her husband. Frank was an older man, perhaps 60, with kind eyes and a steady, unhurried manner that immediately put Elena at ease despite the tension coiled tightly in her chest. He listened carefully as she explained the situation, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression giving nothing away as she described the hospital disappearance, the disabled camera, Dante's secretive behavior, and finally, the photograph connecting Salvatore Greco to Marco Belloni. "This is a serious situation," Frank said once she finished, setting down his pen. "The kind of people involved here, if what you're telling me is accurate, are not amateurs. I want to help you, Mrs. Marchetti, but I need you to understand the risks involved. If your husband's associates discover you've hired outside help, especially help investigating people close to him, it could put you and your surviving daughter in danger. I understand the risk, Elena said firmly, but I can't sit and wait any longer, hoping Dante's world handles this the way it's supposed to. My daughter has been missing for over a week. Every day that passes, the chances of finding her safely grow smaller. I need someone who isn't afraid to look in places the police can't, and places my husband won't. Frank studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll take the case, but we do this carefully, and we do this quietly. No sudden moves, no direct confrontations until we have solid information. Agreed? Agreed, Elena said, relief washing through her for the first time in days. Over the following week, Frank worked methodically, using contacts Elena did not fully understand to gather information about Marco Belloni's operations, and, more carefully, about Salvatore Greco's recent activities. He reported back to Elena in brief, private meetings, always in different locations, always with careful attention to ensuring neither of them was followed. What he discovered painted a picture far more complicated than Elena had initially imagined. Marco Belloni, it turned out, had indeed been locked in an escalating conflict with Dante's organization over control of waterfront territory, a dispute that had grown increasingly personal over the past year. But Frank's investigation suggested something Elena had not considered. Marco's own organization had been suffering internal struggles as well, with whispers of a power shift among his closest associates, some of whom reportedly disagreed with his aggressive approach toward the Marchetti family. There's a name that keeps coming up, Frank told her during their third meeting, sliding a folder across the small cafe table between them. Someone named Victor Salerno. He's been positioning himself as Marco's second-in-command over the past several months, and from what my sources tell me, he's been pushing for more drastic action against your husband's organization than Marco himself was originally comfortable with. Elena opened the folder to find a photograph of a younger man, sharp-featured and cold-eyed, standing beside Marco Belloni at what appeared to be a business gathering. You think this Victor person could be responsible for taking Sofia, not Marco himself? It's possible, Frank said. Sometimes the person giving the orders isn't the one who actually planned the details. If Victor wanted to prove his own strength within the organization, taking something as valuable and personal as your daughter would send an unmistakable message, both to your husband and to Marco himself, about what Victor is capable of. Elena felt sick at the thought that her daughter might have been taken not even because of Dante's direct enemies, but as a pawn in some internal struggle for power within a rival organization she had never even known existed until days ago. But there was still the matter of Salvatore, and the photograph connecting him to Marco's circle. What about Salvatore? She asked. Have you found anything connecting him directly to this Victor Salerno, or to the disappearance itself? Frank's expression grew more serious. This is where things get complicated, Mrs. Marchetti. I did some digging into Salvatore Greco's finances, quietly, through channels that won't lead back to either of us. Over the past 6 months, several unusually large deposits have appeared in an account linked to him, deposits that don't correspond to any legitimate business dealings I can find associated with your husband's organization. Elena's stomach twisted painfully. You're saying Salvatore has been paid by someone, possibly by Marco's people? I can't say for certain yet, Frank admitted. The money could be connected to something else entirely, some other deal. Salvatore's been working outside your husband's knowledge. But given the photograph you found, given the timing of these deposits, and given his position of trust that would have allowed him inside knowledge of hospital security details and your family's schedule, he has to be considered a serious suspect. Elena sat in stunned silence for several long moments, processing the implications. If Salvatore had betrayed Dante, had sold information to Marco's organization, or to this ambitious Victor Salerno, it meant someone Dante trusted completely, someone who had been present at their wedding, who had held both twin girls just hours before Sofia vanished, had played a direct role in orchestrating her disappearance. I need to tell Dante, she said finally, though uncertainty colored her voice. He deserves to know what we've found. even if it means revealing that I hired you against his wishes." Frank nodded slowly. "That's your decision to make. But I'd encourage caution. If your husband confronts Salvatore directly without solid proof, and Salvatore is innocent, it could damage a relationship that's taken years to build, one that might still prove valuable in finding your daughter. And if Salvatore is guilty, a confrontation without proper preparation could give him time to cover his tracks, or worse, could put you and Dante in direct danger." Elena left the meeting with more questions than answers, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never considered before hiring Frank. That evening, she found herself standing outside Dante's study for nearly 20 minutes, working up the courage to knock, uncertain how to begin a conversation that would reveal both her secret investigation and her suspicions about a man Dante considered practically family. When she finally entered, Dante looked up from a stack of papers spread across his desk, dark circles beneath his eyes, testament to another sleepless night. "Elena," he said, surprised, "I thought you were resting." "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her, "about Salvatore." Something shifted in Dante's expression immediately, a flicker of wariness that told Elena he had already been harboring doubts of his own. "What about him?" Slowly, carefully, Elena explained everything. The photograph connecting Salvatore to Marco's circle, Frank's investigation into the suspicious deposits, the theory about Victor Salerno's ambitions within the rival organization. She braced herself for anger, for questions about why she had gone behind his back to hire outside help, but instead, Dante's reaction was something far more troubling. He simply sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let out a long, exhausted breath. "I suspected something wasn't right with him weeks ago," Dante admitted quietly. Small things. Meetings, he claimed, were about one matter that seemed to involve something else entirely. Questions he asked that seemed designed to learn more than he should have needed to know. "I told myself I was being paranoid, that after 20 years of loyalty, I owed him the benefit of the doubt." "And now?" Elena pressed. "Now I don't know what to believe," Dante said, opening his eyes to meet hers directly. "But I intend to find out, carefully, quietly. I won't confront him until I have proof, real proof, because if I'm wrong, I lose one of the few people I've trusted with my life for 2 decades. And if I'm right," he trailed off, his jaw tightening with barely restrained fury. "If you're right, he helped take our daughter," Elena finished for him. Dante nodded grimly. "If I'm right, he will answer for what he's done, one way or another." Over the following days, an uneasy alliance formed between Elena and Dante, both of them working in careful tandem, though Dante still refused to bring the police fully into his suspicions, insisting that any misstep could alert Salvatore or Marco's people before they could gather enough evidence to act safely. Frank continued his investigation from the outside, while Dante began quietly testing Salvatore, feeding him small pieces of false information about the investigation's progress, to see whether that information somehow made its way back to Marco's organization. The test proved damning almost immediately. Within 2 days of telling Salvatore a fabricated detail about a supposed lead pointing toward a completely different rival organization on the other side of the city, Frank reported that Marco Belloni's people had suddenly redirected their own security precautions toward that same false location, an impossible coincidence unless someone within Dante's inner circle had passed along the information directly. Confronted with this evidence, laid out carefully in Dante's study late one night, Salvatore's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Elena watched from the doorway, having insisted on being present despite Dante's initial reluctance, as Salvatore's face shifted from confused denial to something closer to resignation. "You don't understand the position I was in," Salvatore said quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Victor came to me months ago with information, threats against my own family if I didn't cooperate. I never wanted this, Dante. I never wanted anyone to hurt the girls. I believed, they only intended to send a warning, to scare you into backing away from the waterfront deal. I did not know they intended to actually take her." "You knew," Dante said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You knew enough to disable that camera. You knew enough to tell them exactly which room, which bassinet, which moment the nursery would be least monitored." Salvatore did not deny it. his silence confirming everything Elena and Dante had feared. Elena felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat, staring at the man who had smiled at her wedding, who had sent gifts for both twins before they were even born, who had betrayed her family so completely, for reasons that still felt impossibly cruel and senseless. "Where is she?" Elena demanded, stepping fully into the room now, unable to remain silent any longer. "Where is my daughter, Salvatore? If you know anything at all, tell me now." Salvatore's eyes met hers, and for the first time, something like genuine remorse flickered across his features. "I don't know exactly where they're keeping her," he admitted. "Victor handled that part personally, kept it separate from me deliberately, I think, in case something like this happened. But I know the general area. A property near the old shipping docks on the east side of the city, one Marco's family has owned for years, mostly abandoned now except for occasional use as a safe location for sensitive matters." Dante's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, Elena feared what he might do next, feared the barely restrained rage simmering just beneath his controlled exterior. But he took a slow breath instead, forcing himself back into the calculated calm that had defined him throughout this entire ordeal. "You will help us," Dante said to Salvatore, his voice low and firm. "You will tell us everything you know about that property, its security, its layout. And depending on how useful you prove to be in bringing my daughter home safely, we will discuss what happens to you afterward." Salvatore nodded quickly, desperate now to prove some measure of remaining loyalty, some path toward redemption for the betrayal he had committed. Elena watched the exchange with a strange mixture of relief and lingering horror. Relief that they finally had a location, a real lead toward finding Sofia, and horror at how close her family had come to losing everything because of a betrayal from within their own trusted circle. That night, as Dante began making careful arrangements to approach the waterfront property, Elena sat alone in the nursery once more, watching Isabella sleep peacefully for what felt like the first time in days. She pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead and whispered softly into the darkness, a promise that felt closer to fulfillment than it had at any point since this nightmare began. "We're going to bring her home," she whispered. "I promise you, we're going to bring your sister home." Outside the nursery window, the city lights glittered in the distance, indifferent as always to the small, desperate battles being fought within individual homes and broken families. But for the first time since Sofia's disappearance, Elena allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, that soon, very soon, her daughter would finally be found. The plan Dante assembled over the following 2 days moved with a precision that reminded Elena, uncomfortably, of exactly how capable her husband was within his world of quiet power and careful strategy. He did not rush toward the waterfront property, despite every instinct in Elena urging immediate action. Instead, he insisted on patience, on gathering as much information as possible before making any move that could put Sofia at greater risk. "If we go in carelessly," Dante explained during a tense conversation in his study, "and Victor Salerno senses any threat, he may panic. People who panic make dangerous decisions. I need to know exactly how many people are guarding that property, what security measures exist, and most importantly, I need confirmation that Sofia is actually being held there before we commit to anything." Elena understood the logic, even as every maternal instinct in her body screamed to move faster, to storm toward that property immediately and tear it apart with her bare hands if necessary, until she found her daughter. But she had come to trust, cautiously, and with lingering reservations, that Dante's careful approach offered the best chance of bringing Sofia home safely, rather than escalating the situation into something even more dangerous. Salvatore, eager to prove his usefulness despite the fractured trust between him and Dante, provided detailed information about the property's layout, drawn from memory of visits made years earlier, before the building had fallen into its current state of quiet disuse. He described a 2-story structure near the water, surrounded by a chain-link fence, typically monitored by no more than 3 or 4 guards during quiet periods, though that number could increase significantly if Victor sensed any threat approaching. Frank Doland, still working quietly on Elena's behalf, confirmed much of what Salvatore described through his own independent surveillance, watching the property from a discreet distance over the course of 2 days. He reported seeing a woman arrive each morning carrying what appeared to be baby formula and supplies, a detail that made Elena's heart simultaneously soar with hope and ache with fresh anguish. Sophia was alive. Someone was caring for her, however coldly, however calculated their reasons for doing so. But she was still there, still trapped in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers instead of her mother's arms. "We move tomorrow night," Dante finally announced, once Frank's surveillance confirmed a pattern of reduced security during the overnight hours. Quietly, carefully, "The goal is to retrieve Sophia without unnecessary conflict. I want this resolved with as little violence as possible." Elena appreciated the sentiment, though she understood better than most that Dante's world rarely allowed situations to resolve so cleanly. She spent that final day before the planned retrieval in a state of nervous, restless energy, unable to focus on anything beyond the countdown of hours until she might finally hold Sophia again. She held Isabella almost constantly, whispering softly to her, promising that soon, very soon, her sister would be coming home to complete their small family once more. That evening, as Dante prepared to leave with a small group of trusted men, Elena insisted on accompanying him, a request that sparked their first real argument since Sophia's disappearance began. "Absolutely not," Dante said firmly, pulling on a dark jacket as he prepared to leave. "It's too dangerous, Elena. I need to know you're safe here, with Isabella, while we handle this." "She's my daughter too," Elena shot back, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "I have spent every single day since she disappeared, imagining the worst, wondering if I would ever see her again. I cannot sit here waiting helplessly while you go retrieve her. I need to be there. I need to see her the moment she's safe." Dante studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and his understanding of exactly how deeply this decision mattered to her. Finally, he sighed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "You can come," he relented, "but you stay in the car, with 2 of my men, until we've confirmed the situation is fully secure. The moment it's safe, I promise you, I will bring her to you myself. Do you understand?" Elena nodded, grateful despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach at the thought of what the night ahead might hold. She kissed Isabella's forehead one final time before leaving her in the care of a trusted housekeeper who had worked for the family for over a decade, then climbed into the back seat of a dark sedan alongside Dante, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. The drive to the waterfront district took nearly 40 minutes, winding through increasingly quiet, industrial streets until the glittering lights of the city center faded behind them, replaced by the darker, more abandoned atmosphere of old shipping warehouses and empty lots. Elena's hands trembled in her lap as the car finally slowed, parking a careful distance from the property Salvatore had described, close enough to move quickly if needed, but far enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. Dante turned to face her before exiting the vehicle, his expression softer than she had seen it in days. "Stay here," he said quietly. "No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, stay in this car until someone comes to get you. I need you safe, Elena. Sophia needs both her parents to come home tonight." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and watched as Dante and 4 of his most trusted men slipped quietly from the vehicle, disappearing into the shadows surrounding the fenced property in the distance. The minutes that followed stretched into what felt like hours, though Elena's watch confirmed barely 15 had passed. She sat frozen in the back seat, straining to hear any sound beyond the quiet hum of the car's engine and the distant lapping of water against the nearby docks. Then, faintly, she heard something that made her breath catch in her throat. A baby's cry, thin and distant, but unmistakably real, carried on the night air from somewhere near the property. Elena's entire body went rigid with hope, so intense, it bordered on physical pain. That was Sophia. She was certain of it, certain in a way that defied logic or explanation, the same deep, instinctive certainty that had convinced her body to continue producing milk for a daughter it refused to believe was truly gone. The 2 men remaining in the car exchanged tense glances but held their position, following Dante's strict instructions despite Elena's obvious distress. She pressed her hand against the car window, watching the darkened property intently, praying silently for some sign, some confirmation that everything was proceeding safely. Nearly 20 more agonizing minutes passed before Elena finally saw movement near the property's entrance, shadows shifting in the darkness that gradually resolved into the familiar shape of Dante's figure, walking quickly toward the car, carrying something small and precious, cradled carefully against his chest. Elena did not wait for permission this time. She threw open the car door and rushed forward, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible despite her body's continued recovery from childbirth. "Sophia!" she gasped, reaching Dante just as he stopped, gently transferring the small, blanket-wrapped bundle into her waiting arms. The infant in her arms stirred, tiny features scrunching slightly at the sudden movement, before settling once more, and Elena felt her entire world narrow down to this single, impossible moment. She stared down at her daughter's face, memorizing every detail, confirming beyond any doubt that this was truly Sophia, alive, breathing, safe in her arms after what had felt like an eternity of desperate searching. "She's healthy," Dante said quietly, relief evident in his voice for the first time since this nightmare began. The woman caring for her, it turns out, was someone hired specifically to keep Sophia safe and cared for, though clearly against her will as much as ours. "She's cooperating fully with us now." Elena barely heard the details, too overwhelmed by the physical reality of finally holding her daughter again to process anything beyond the warmth of Sophia's small body against her chest. Tears streamed freely down her face, mixing relief and lingering trauma into an overwhelming flood of emotion she made no attempt to contain. "What about Victor?" she asked eventually, once some measure of composure returned. "Was he there? Is this over?" Dante's expression darkened slightly. He wasn't present tonight. It seems he anticipated the possibility of discovery and kept his distance, leaving only hired help to manage Sophia's care. "This isn't over, Elena. Not completely, but we have her back, and that matters more right now than anything else." The drive home felt entirely different from the tense journey that had brought them to the waterfront property. Elena sat in the back seat, Sophia cradled securely against her chest, unable to stop staring at her daughter's peaceful, sleeping face, still hardly able to believe this moment was real, rather than another cruel trick of exhaustion and desperate hope. When they arrived home, Isabella was still awake, despite the late hour, fussing restlessly in the housekeeper's arms. The moment Elena carried Sophia into the nursery and laid her gently in the second crib, something remarkable happened. Isabella's cries stopped almost instantly, her small body relaxing visibly, as though some invisible tether, stretched painfully thin across the days of separation, had finally snapped back into place. The twins, reunited after more than a week apart, seemed to sense each other's presence immediately, settling into a peaceful stillness that Elena had not witnessed from either of them since the disappearance began. Elena stood between the two cribs for a long time that night, watching her daughters sleep peacefully side by side, feeling something loosen in her own chest that had remained tightly wound since the moment she first discovered Sophia missing. The physical ache that had haunted her body for days, the persistent, cruel certainty that Sophia was still out there needing her, finally began to ease, replaced by something closer to genuine peace. But even as relief washed over her, Elena understood, with the same clear-eyed certainty that had guided her through the darkest days of this ordeal, that true safety remained elusive as long as Victor Salerno remained free, still harboring whatever ambitions had driven him to target her family in the first place. Dante's words echoed in her mind, a sobering reminder amid the joy of Sophia's return. This isn't over. Not completely. Downstairs, she could hear Dante's voice once more, low and urgent, already making calls, already planning whatever came next in this dangerous game that had upended their lives so completely. Elena pressed a gentle kiss to each of her daughters' foreheads, savoring this fragile moment of peace before whatever challenges still lay ahead. Sophia was home. That much at least was finally, blessedly true. But Elena knew, deep in the same instinctive place that had never stopped believing her daughter was alive, that their family's fight for true safety was far from finished. The days following Sophia's return brought a fragile sense of normalcy back into the Marchetti household, though Elena found herself unable to fully relax into it, always listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there, always checking twice to ensure the nursery door was locked before allowing herself to sleep. Both twins seemed to settle more easily now that they were reunited, their restless cries growing less frequent, their small bodies finding comfort in each other's presence during the long nights. Yet Elena's own body took longer to recover from the trauma of separation, waking at odd hours convinced something was wrong, only to find both daughters peacefully asleep in their cribs. Dante had grown quieter since bringing Sofia home, spending long hours in his study reviewing information Salvatore continued to provide as part of his ongoing effort to rebuild some measure of trust. Elena watched her husband carefully during this period, noticing the way exhaustion and unresolved tension had carved new lines into his face, the way his easy confidence had been replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. She understood, without needing to ask directly, that Dante was building towards something, some final resolution to the conflict with Marco Belloni's organization and the ambitious Victor Salerno, who had orchestrated Sofia's disappearance. "I want to be part of whatever happens next," Elena told him one evening, finding him alone in his study, long after the household had gone quiet. "I know you want to protect me from this world, Dante, but I've already proven I can navigate it when necessary. I found the connection to Marco. I hired Frank when your own methods weren't moving fast enough. I deserve to understand what comes next." Dante set down the papers he had been reviewing, studying her with an expression that mixed pride and lingering worry in equal measure. "Victor Salerno is not someone who backs down easily," he said carefully. "Salvatore's information suggests he's been positioning himself to challenge Marco's leadership directly, using the success of Sofia's abduction as proof of his capabilities to the rest of the organization. If we move against him carelessly, it could spark exactly the kind of wider conflict I've spent years trying to avoid." "Then what's your plan?" Elena pressed. "You can't simply wait for him to try something again." Dante was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I've reached out to Marco directly," he admitted. "Through a mutual contact, someone both organizations trust to facilitate difficult conversations without violence. I want to meet with him, to make clear that what Victor did was unauthorized, unacceptable, and that continued aggression will not go unanswered. But I also want to offer him something in return, an opportunity to resolve the waterfront dispute peacefully, to remove Victor's influence within his organization, before his ambition destroys what remains of the fragile peace between our families." Elena considered this, surprised by the diplomatic approach given everything Dante's world had put her through over the past 2 weeks. "You think Marco didn't know what Victor was planning?" "I believe it's possible," Dante said. "Salvatore's information suggests Marco intended only a warning, something to pressure me during our territorial negotiations, not the actual abduction of an infant. Victor may have exceeded his authority, seeing an opportunity to prove himself capable of decisive action that Marco himself was hesitant to take. If that's true, Marco may be just as eager as we are to see Victor's ambitions contained before they cause further damage to both our organizations." The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at a neutral location suggested by the mutual contact Dante had mentioned, a quiet restaurant on the edge of the city that had apparently hosted similar sensitive negotiations between rival families for decades. Elena insisted on being present, a request Dante initially resisted, but eventually agreed to, recognizing perhaps that her presence might actually strengthen their position, demonstrating that this conflict had personal stakes extending beyond mere business territory. The restaurant, when they arrived, appeared entirely ordinary from the outside, its dim lighting and quiet atmosphere suggesting nothing of the tense negotiations that had likely unfolded within its private back room over the years. Marco Belloni arrived precisely on time, accompanied by only 2 associates, neither of whom Elena recognized from the photograph Frank had shown her weeks earlier. Victor Salerno, notably, was absent, which Elena took as either a positive sign of Marco's own suspicions toward his ambitious subordinate, or a troubling indication that Victor had already begun operating independently of Marco's direct authority. Marco was an older man than Elena had expected, perhaps approaching 60, with a tired, weathered face that seemed to carry the weight of decades spent navigating a dangerous world. He greeted Dante with cautious civility, and when his gaze shifted to Elena, something like genuine regret flickered across his expression. "Mrs. Marchetti," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent shaped by decades in the city, despite origins clearly rooted elsewhere. "I want you to know, before anything else is discussed today, that what happened to your daughter was never something I sanctioned. I have children of my own, grandchildren now. The thought of what you must have endured these past weeks sits heavily with me, regardless of the business disputes that exist between our families. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity in his words, but found only the exhausted honesty of a man who seemed genuinely troubled by what had unfolded. Then why hasn't Victor Salerno faced any consequences? She asked directly. If you truly didn't sanction what happened, why does he remain free to threaten other families the way he threatened mine? A heavy silence fell over the table before Marco finally responded. Victor has been building support within my organization for some time now, quietly positioning himself as an alternative leader for those who believe my approach has grown too cautious, too willing to negotiate rather than assert dominance through more forceful means. Removing him carries risks of its own, risks of fracturing my organization at a moment when unity matters more than ever. So you're willing to let him remain free, Dante said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, simply to preserve your own position of leadership? I did not say that, Marco replied firmly. I said the situation requires careful handling, which is precisely why I agreed to this meeting today. I propose an arrangement. I will move against Victor's growing influence within my organization, removing his authority and any capacity he might have to act against your family again. In exchange, I ask that you consider ending your expansion into the waterfront territory, allowing my organization to retain what remains of our traditional holdings there. Dante considered this proposal carefully, his expression giving little away as he weighed the implications. Elena watched the negotiation unfold with a strange mixture of fascination and unease, recognizing that this conversation, however diplomatically conducted, represented exactly the kind of dangerous world she had hoped to shield her daughters from entirely. I'll agree to halt further expansion, Dante said finally, on one condition. I need proof that Victor Salerno faces real consequences for what he did, not simply a quiet removal from influence that allows him to continue operating in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to prove himself. My family requires assurance that this threat has been genuinely eliminated, not merely postponed. Marco nodded slowly, seeming to have anticipated this demand. I understand your position. I will ensure Victor answers appropriately for his actions, in a manner that removes any possibility of continued threat to your family. This I can promise you directly. The negotiation continued for another hour, working through specific details of the territorial agreement and the timeline for addressing Victor's situation, though Elena found her attention drifting increasingly toward thoughts of her daughters waiting safely at home. When the meeting finally concluded, Dante and Marco shook hands with the careful formality of men who understood the fragile nature of the peace they had just negotiated, an agreement that could unravel as easily as it had been constructed if either side failed to honor their commitments. As they drove home that evening, Elena found herself studying her husband's profile in the passenger seat beside her, noticing the way tension had begun to ease from his shoulders for the first time in weeks. Do you believe him? She asked quietly. That he'll actually deal with Victor properly? I believe he understands the alternative, Dante said carefully. If Victor continues operating unchecked and causes further problems, the consequences for Marco's entire organization would be severe. Self-interest, if nothing else, should ensure he follows through on what he's promised. Elena nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her chest despite Dante's reassurances. True peace felt like a fragile, uncertain thing within this world Dante inhabited, always vulnerable to the ambitions of men like Victor Salerno, who saw violence and fear as tools for advancement rather than threats to be avoided. 3 days later, Frank Doland contacted Elena with information that finally allowed her to breathe a genuine sigh of relief. Through his own careful monitoring of the situation, he confirmed that Victor Salerno had abruptly disappeared from his usual haunts throughout the city, with reliable sources suggesting he had been quietly removed from any position of authority within Marco's organization following an internal confrontation that had apparently grown quite heated. Whether Victor remained alive somewhere, stripped of his ambitions and influence, or whether Marco had chosen a more permanent solution to eliminate the threat entirely, Frank could not say with certainty, and Elena found herself reluctant to press for details she wasn't entirely certain she wanted to know. What mattered, ultimately, was that the immediate threat to her family appeared to have been neutralized, the dangerous chapter that had begun with Sophia's disappearance finally reaching some measure of resolution. Elena allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to imagine a future where her daughters could grow up without the constant shadow of danger looming over their family, though she understood with clear-eyed realism that Dante's world would never be entirely free of such risks. That evening, as she stood once more between her daughters' cribs, watching them sleep peacefully side by side, Elena felt something shift within her own heart, a slow, cautious return of hope that had felt entirely absent during the darkest days of Sophia's disappearance. The fight to protect her family was far from over. She understood that much clearly now. But for tonight, at least, both her daughters were safe, breathing peacefully in the quiet darkness of their shared nursery, and that simple, precious truth was enough to hold on to as she finally allowed herself to rest. 3 months passed before Elena finally felt the last remnants of fear loosen their grip on her daily life. The twins had grown steadily stronger, healthier, and more settled with each passing week, their early restlessness gradually fading into the ordinary rhythms of infant life, filled with feedings and naps, and the small, precious milestones that came with watching 2 tiny humans grow more aware of the world around them. Isabella and Sophia had developed an unmistakable closeness even in these early months, often reaching for each other during quiet moments, calming instantly whenever placed side by side, as though some invisible thread connecting them since before birth had never truly loosened, despite the terrifying separation they had endured. Elena's own body had finally settled as well, the strange, persistent ache that had haunted her during Sophia's disappearance, fading gradually as the reality of her daughter's safe return sank fully into both her mind and her physical being. She still woke some nights from dreams that carried her back to that terrifying hospital hallway, the empty bassinet, the crushing weight of not knowing whether she would ever see Sophia again. But those dreams grew less frequent with time, replaced increasingly by the simple, grounding comfort of hearing both her daughters breathing steadily in the nursery down the hall. Dante had changed too, in ways Elena noticed gradually, rather than all at once. He spent more time at home now, more time simply sitting with his daughters, watching them with an attentiveness that had been largely absent before the crisis that nearly tore their family apart. He had also, quietly and without much discussion, begun stepping back from certain aspects of his business dealings, delegating more responsibility to trusted associates, while keeping himself more available for the family that had nearly been shattered by the dangerous world he inhabited. Salvatore remained a complicated presence in their lives, his betrayal never fully forgiven, though Dante had ultimately decided against the harsher consequences some might have expected, given the severity of what he'd done. Instead, Salvatore had been relieved of his most sensitive responsibilities, relegated to a diminished role within the organization, closely monitored, and no longer trusted with anything approaching his former level of access. Elena still felt a lingering chill whenever she encountered him during rare occasions when business brought him near the family home, unable to fully release the memory of his role in Sophia's abduction, however coerced his participation might have been. The territorial agreement with Marco Belloni's organization held steady throughout those months, an uneasy but functional peace settling between the 2 families that had once stood on the brink of much wider conflict. Elena learned, through occasional updates Dante shared with her, that Victor Salerno had indeed been removed permanently from any position of influence, though the exact details of his fate remained something Dante seemed unwilling to discuss directly, and Elena found herself, with some discomfort, accepting that certain aspects of this resolution were simply better left unexamined. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in early spring, Elena sat on the back porch of their home, watching as Dante lay on a blanket spread across the grass, both twins propped carefully beside him as he made ridiculous faces that sent them into fits of delighted giggling. The afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the trees surrounding their property, casting warm patterns across the grass, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Elena felt something close to genuine, uncomplicated peace settle over her. She thought back often to those terrifying early days, to the hollow ache in her body that had refused to accept Sophia's absence, to the desperate investigation she had pursued alongside Frank Doland, to the tense negotiations and dangerous confrontations that had ultimately brought her daughter home. It had been the most frightening experience of her life, one that had tested every assumption she'd once held about her marriage, her family, and the dangerous world Dante inhabited beyond the walls of their comfortable home. But it had also revealed a strength within herself she hadn't fully recognized before, a fierce, unwavering determination to protect her children that had carried her through darkness she never could have imagined surviving. Frank Doland remained a quiet but valued presence in their lives, even after the immediate crisis resolved, occasionally checking in with Elena to ensure the family remained safe, a small but meaningful connection to the version of herself that had refused to simply wait helplessly while others determined her family's fate. Elena had thanked him more times than she could count for his help during those desperate weeks, and though he always waved away her gratitude with characteristic modesty, she understood clearly how much his careful, methodical investigation had contributed to Sophia's eventual safe return. Detective Alvarez, too, remained periodically in contact, though the official investigation into Sophia's disappearance had eventually closed without full resolution given the complicated, unofficial circumstances of her actual recovery. Elena had never shared the complete truth with the detective, understanding that doing so would expose Dante and his associates to consequences neither of them were prepared to face. It was a compromise that sat uneasily with her sense of justice, though she found herself, in quiet moments of reflection, grateful simply that her daughter had come home safely, regardless of the complicated, imperfect path that had led to that outcome. As the afternoon stretched onward, Elena rose from her seat on the porch and walked across the lawn to join her family on the blanket, settling beside Dante as he continued entertaining their daughters with silly expressions and gentle tickles that sent them both into renewed giggles. Sophia reached toward her mother with small, grasping hands, and Elena lifted her daughter into her arms, pressing a soft kiss against her forehead, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her skin. "We made it through," Dante said quietly, watching Elena with an expression that mixed exhaustion and profound gratitude in equal measure. "I know these past months haven't been easy, Elena. I know my world put our family in danger in ways I never wanted to happen. I'm sorry for that, more than I can properly express." Elena studied her husband for a long moment, considering everything they had endured together, the trust that had fractured and slowly, carefully begun rebuilding itself over these difficult months. "We made it through together," she corrected gently. "That matters more to me than dwelling on how we got here. I won't pretend everything about your world doesn't frighten me, Dante, but I've also learned I'm stronger than I ever realized, and that I won't simply stand by helplessly if our family faces danger again. We're partners in this now, in every sense, not just in raising our daughters, but in protecting them too." Dante reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, as they both watched Isabella attempt to reach for a bright yellow butterfly that had landed briefly on the blanket beside her, squealing with delighted frustration when it fluttered away just beyond her tiny reach. Sophia settled contentedly against Elena's chest, her small body relaxed and peaceful in a way that still occasionally brought tears to Elena's eyes when she remembered how close she had come to losing this simple, precious moment entirely. The nightmare that had begun with an empty hospital bassinet felt increasingly distant now, though Elena understood it would never fully disappear from her memory, would always remain a defining chapter in the story of their family, one that had tested them beyond anything either of them could have anticipated on that joyful day both twins were born. But they had survived it. They had fought for each other, uncovered dangerous truths, confronted betrayal within their own trusted circle, and ultimately emerged with their family whole once more, stronger and more united than they had been before everything nearly fell apart. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Elena leaned her head against Dante's shoulder, both daughters settled peacefully between them, and allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply exist within this precious, hard-won moment of peace. Her body no longer ached with the phantom certainty of a missing child. Her heart no longer raced with constant, underlying fear. Sophia was here, safe and warm in her arms, exactly where she belonged, and Isabella rested contentedly beside her sister, both twins finally whole again after everything that had threatened to tear them apart. The world beyond their quiet backyard remained as complicated and occasionally dangerous as it had always been, filled with the kind of shadows and hidden threats that came with a life connected to Dante's particular world of power and consequence. But within the boundaries of their home, within the circle of their small, resilient family, Elena finally felt something she had feared she might never fully reclaim after those terrifying early days. She felt safe. She felt whole. And as she watched her daughters drift toward sleep in the gentle warmth of the fading afternoon sun, she understood with quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them now exactly as they had faced this one. Together, unbroken, and unwilling to ever again let fear silence the truth their hearts already knew.